Coming up on the Razzball Fantasy Football Podcast, we're going to break down the top wide receiver matchups for Week 14. That's why we're going to be using our slot versus wide points per game allowed tool over on Razzball.com. Stay tuned for all the starts, the sits, and streamers right now on the Razzball Fantasy YouTube channel. And as always, bringing in my colleague, Ben Wasley. You can follow him at Fantasy First Down. Drop that O on Twitter. What's going on, Ben?
What is happening, mate? Look, it's that fantasy playoff run. You've got one more chance. I'll tell you what, there's a couple of leagues where I'm feeling pretty nervy about it, getting those start-sits sorted, hoping that I'm making the right choices to get into those fantasy playoffs. So hopefully a lot of you out there already got your bye week sorted and you're feeling a lot more chill than I am right now. But when you're in like a lot of leagues like we are, you're always going to have a couple where you're nervous, right, Bobby?
Well, in my biggest league, I have the lead for the number 2 seed. Don't worry about it's just that smoky feel of that hazy fantasy football. And if you're listening on the audio side, you already know for the last 14 weeks, my camera decides to always crap out right at the perfect time. But yes, I actually have, so what we do is we do top half of the league gets a win and also head to head every week. So everybody is still like so involved because you can lose 2 games and win 2 games every single week. So I could be the 2 seed and get a bye, or I could slide all the way down to the 6. The good news is I've at least solidified a playoff spot, but I want that first round bye. So it's funny when you're doing roster setup too, because like you want to think ahead. Because I'm like, do I stash the Broncos defense for week 16? And I'm like, all right, I gotta. So because I have the Dolphins right now. So we just did an episode on must-have defenses, and so I'm like, the news comes out about Ramondre Stevenson. I'm like, do I pick up Zeke Elliott right now? And I'm like, why am I picking up a running back I won't use? So I didn't do it. And then the guy I'm competing with the number 2 spot with picks up Zeke because his team is trash. Picks up Zeke. Zeke drops like 20 plus. So yes, it's a lot going on. I just have to focus on myself. But I am. What's your biggest, kind of like your own start sit? What's your biggest? What's on the line this week for you, Ben? What's like the number one thing you're really kind of going back and forth on heading into the playoffs?
Oh, man, my home league, my main league is a 14-team league, and it's very competitive, and we take it very seriously, and we've been going for a while. And it's that sort of situation where I drafted Austin Eckler in the first round, and I'll tell you what, you do not want to draft Austin Eckler in the first round this year. It is hard to come back from. I kind of need everything to go right for me. I'm still in the hunt. I'm 7-6. I'm feeling good. Just picked up Clyde Edwards-Helaire because in a 14-team league where you've got 2 flex spots, he becomes pretty valuable this week with the probability that Pacheco's out. So I'm like, do I start him? Do I start Tajay Spears? I mean, it's all happening. It's all happening over here. But I got the 32-team league with the same issues, like all sorts of wacky start decisions. So, hey, if you got start-sit decisions, pop them in the comments as well.
I got to tell you, too, the best part about this right now is that we're talking about Zeke and Clyde Edwards-Helaire with the season on the line, folks. And that's why I hate fantasy football right there. So it doesn't matter how much research you do, my friend. Zeke Elliott's somehow going to help you. And that was not going to be on my bingo card this year. All right, let's get into the top out-wide matchups. So how we do this today, if you haven't checked it out yet on Razzball.com, what we have done, we have created a tool that shows you how many fantasy points a defense allows in the slot and out wide to wide receivers. This is a fantastic tool to help you decide between starts and sits, DFS, whatever you need. And every single week, me and Ben break down the top out wide matchups, the slot matchups, and some notable downgrades that could really impact start-sit questions. So let's get into some of the top out wide matchups. And today's show, we're going to focus more on maybe the wide receiver 2, 3 flex plays because there's some studs that are in here as well. But let's start at the top. We have Brandin Cooks against Philadelphia, Jaylen Waddle against Tennessee, Drake London against Tampa, Metcalf and Lockett against San Francisco, and Flowers and Beckham against the Rams. Starting with Brandin Cooks. We all know CeeDee Lamb is in. We're not sweating. But Brandin Cooks at home against the Eagles is something to consider as a wide receiver 2 this week. Notable performances against the Eagles for tandems purposes. Debo and Ayuk, Diggs and Davis, Dotson, McLaurin. So 2 wide receivers have gone off against this defense. However, Brandin Cooks, 1 catch, 7 yards. last time they faced off. What's your thoughts here this week, Brett? Is Brandin Cooks in your lineups if you haven't been?
He's a bit of a scary one, isn't he? The fact that he's only gotten over 4 receptions this season once makes him very hard to rely on. Now, he has saved it with touchdowns a lot. He's got 5 touchdowns in the last 7 weeks. But do you want to rely on a guy that doesn't have that PPR floor? I don't know that I really do. He is at home this week. Last time they played against the Eagles, they were away. The over-under on this game is 51.5 points, with the Cowboys as favourites, which means we're expecting a high-scoring game. The Eagles' run defense is really good, so it's not like the Cowboys are going to be able to run out the game. So you'd have to feel like there's going to be a lot of passing, but will enough of it go to Cooks? We know that CeeDee Lamb's going to get double-digit targets. We know that Jake Ferguson's still really involved. Peyton Hendershot comes back this week. They'll probably check down to the running backs occasionally. Michael Gallup and Jalen Tolbert always seem to get a couple of targets. There's a lot of targets to go around. But having said that, I'm still starting Brandin Cooks. He's a wide receiver 3 for me. He's a little bit scary, but the upside's huge in this matchup. And I feel like in this situation, you really need to shoot for that upside rather than being scared and just going for an average score.
Yeah, I got a question for you at the end of the podcast because I am literally in the muck with my wide receiver 3 decision I have to make this week, but we'll get to that in a second. Here's why I'm in on Brandin Cooks. A stat came up recently. I was watching some ESPN, whatever, one of the big ones, and they talked about the Cowboys at home versus the Eagles. And over the last, since Dak has been the starting quarterback, they have been extremely good. But recently, they've been amazing at home against the Eagles. They have scored at least 37 points in 4 straight games at home versus the Eagles. Now, Cooks at home this season, the past 4 home games, he's averaged at least 14 PPR points per game and finishes a top 24 wide receiver in 3 of those 4 games. So the matchup's good. Cooks plays better at home. The Cowboys as a whole play at home. And if you just look at the Eagles as a defense, they are an air yards defense. They're tied for first in the NFL in air yards allowed per game. Brandin Cooks, 42nd in air yards and ADOT, and only 100th in yards after the catch. So it fits what he does as well. So that's why I'm in on Cooks. But the question for you at the end, you're going to love because it's going to be about another player we're going to talk about in a second. Let's jump down to the next player, and that is Jaylen Waddle versus the Tennessee Titans. Now, a lot of people are going to sit here and say, of course you're starting Waddle, but Waddle has not been that consistent this season. He's actually been more of like a wide receiver 3 on most games, but he gets a prime matchup against the Tennessee Titans that allow the 3rd most fantasy points out wide. That's where Waddle gets most of his fantasy points. Colts wide receivers, Calvin Ridley, Mike Evans, Deontay Johnson, Zay Flowers, you name it. People have gone off against this Tennessee Titans defense. What's your thoughts about Waddle? Is he a must-start wide receiver 2 in your opinion?
He's very safe. We know that he's getting at least 5 targets every week. There hasn't been a single game this season where he hasn't gotten at least 5 targets. What's the concern is the ceiling. He's only had more than 8 targets 3 times. He's had between 35 and 63 yards every week but 2 since week 2. So he's ending up in that region where you're only getting about 8 PPR points most weeks. He hasn't been getting the touchdowns because he's only had 8 red zone targets compared to Tyreek Hill's 17. And no one else is really getting red zone targets either. They don't tend to throw in the red zone a lot. The 3rd most red zone targets is Salvon Ahmed, of all people. So realistically, there isn't really that much of a ceiling here. The problem is that we don't know how many targets he's going to get, but we know it's probably going to be low. We don't know what he's going to do with them, but he doesn't tend to make a lot of big plays, and his touchdown upside is limited. So you can start him, and realistically, based on where you draft him, you probably have to, but you need to be realistic. You're aiming for about 10 PPR points, and that's a solid week for Jaylen Waddle at the moment. Now, having said that, we said this the other week when he played against the Jets, and he absolutely blew up out of nowhere. So there is clearly the possibility that he'll randomly have a good game, but against the Titans, do they even got to need to throw enough to make this happen? I don't think so. He's really scary to me. He kind of has to be in that wide receiver 2-3 conversation, but I don't feel good about it at all.
Oh, God, everything you just said, 10 PPR points just made me feel sick to my stomach. Like, it's just so boring. Like, and here's the thing about Jaylen Waddle that annoyed the shit out of me. Because, like, listen, when we're wrong, I want to know why I'm wrong. Like, I admit, I was off Jaylen Waddle against the Jets. I sat him everywhere. I go in, and I get the numbers from PFF afterwards. He had 4 targets, 4 receptions, 73 yards from the slot. All season prior to that Jets game, he had 139 yards receiving from the slot. So in 11 games, 139 yards, one game, 78 yards. Where did that even come from? Like, it made no sense. And sure enough, Waddle looks good. I look like an idiot, and I have to decide why the world is just the worst. Anyway, but like, so when you're looking at the whole matchup, Waddle is just, he is the most expensive handcuff in fantasy football. He's the Tyreek Hill handcuff, but you paid a second to third round pick for him, most likely a second. Here it is. I loved Waddle, and I have to own it. He's safe. You're right. You're probably, the other thing though is like in half PPR, he's actually not that safe. Like, he gets you 8 points. Like, 8 points from your wide receiver 2/3 is not good. Like, that's a losing number. And that's what he's been a lot this year. He's been he's been at, I think it was 11 PPR points in 2/3 of his games this season. So anyway, that all being said, the Tennessee Titans can't stop. Jeffrey Simmons, stud defensive tackle, is out. Jeffrey Simmons is like the closest thing to we have Chris Jones. He's like the poor man's Chris Jones and Aaron Donald. He's a dominant force as defensive tackle for the Titans. He's out. I am not scared by the Tennessee Titan defense because of that. I think that they're just going to do whatever they want. You're probably going to get 5 catches for 65 to 70 yards from Waddle, and that's going to be your day. It is what it is. I can throw a bunch of numbers at you, but it just doesn't matter. It's just, he's been what he's been. He's got a great matchup. You're not going to, if he doesn't do well, it's not your fault, okay? It's not your fault if Jaylen Waddle goes 5 for 65 or 70, and that's the day. That might be the day. It is what it is, folks.
And that would be a good day, honestly.
I know, right? I know. So when we get to my question at the end of the show, you're gonna love it because there's gonna be a lot of these names floating around in that question. Anyway, let's jump down to the next one. It's Drake London going up against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. Now, there's a lot of injuries right now that are very important. The Tampa Bay Bucs are not going to have Jamel Dean, one of their top outside corners. They also going to be down Devin White, one of their top linebackers as well. We just kind of saw Jonathan Mingo and the Carolina Panthers show a little something against them. So it is a little bit of a bump for Drake London's matchup this week. The Tampa Bay Bucs already allow the 5th most fantasy points out wide over the last 6 weeks. My apologies. Earlier this year, he had a nice PPR day on the road, 6 for 54. So what's your thoughts here, Ben? Is Drake London in your lineups this week as a wide receiver 3?
It's really hard to know what to expect from the Bucs at the moment. They're so banged up with their linebackers. They had one healthy linebacker last week. It's crazy. They've got a couple more back this week, but it's an area they're really struggling in, and you have to feel like the Falcons are the favorites here. In fact, the bookies have the Falcons as the favorite by about 3.5 points. Where are those points going to come from? Well, it's not that easy to run on the Bucs, but with all their linebackers banged up, that changes things a little bit, and Vita Vea is probably out. It's also pretty hard to throw on the Bucs, but if you target them out wide, you do have some success. Having said that, the Falcons haven't thrown to their out wide receivers when they've been ahead. So it's one of these weird situations where you should be throwing out wide, but once you're ahead, the Falcons usually don't throw out wide. So I have no idea what's going to happen here. They might just choose to run, which would be a bad strategy, or they might go against their general tendencies and throw out wide, which would be the good strategy, but would be unexpected based on what they usually do. I can't trust London in a game that they're expected to win, but there clearly is upside. It's a good matchup. They're missing Jamel Dean, as you said. London should be a guy they go to. I just have no idea if they will or not. That makes him really boom bust. It's that sort of situation where he might have a really quiet game and they just try to ground and pound it. Or it might be a situation where they recognize this is the time to throw. Maybe we should actually do it. What do you reckon is going to happen?
Here's a couple things. Like this time of year, like in the preseason, we've talked a little bit about this too, is like how players perform in wins and losses, right? And this time of year, it's more about like home and away splits. Like you might be able to find something there. There's a lot of players right now that actually perform pretty well at home versus away, and Drake London is one of those guys. If you look at his home road splits, he offers a much safer floor in home games. This season, he's averaged just over 5 receptions and 72 yards at home. So that right there just makes me feel like, okay, not only is the matchup good, but he's playing at home against this good matchup. So I feel like he's going to be a safe wide receiver 3. He's already shown that he got 6 for 54 the last time they faced off on the road. And if you dive into the matchup, the Bucs, you could beat him anyway, right? They're 6th in air yards allowed per game, 2nd in yards after the catch. Drake London's a little more air yards oriented. He's not really great at either right now. But I just think that if you look at his lineup percentages, he's projected, to line up mostly against the backup cornerback and not Charlton Davis. Now, granted, I think if the Bucs are smart, they'll just shadow Davis on London, which could happen. The Bucs do play enough man to do that, but I am not going to fade it. Charlton Davis, for some reason, just took a huge step back this year under Todd Bowles, so I'm not fading the matchup at all. I think if you have London, bring him to the Sunday live show because I think he's definitely startable. I think I actually wouldn't mind starting him, and he might even be a DFS option this week because he's not really that high priced. All right. Let's jump down to the next one here, folks. It's Metcalf and Lockett going up against the San Francisco 49ers. Now, the San Francisco 49ers have blacked out. It's over. Like, their defense, they're in. They're all good now. Whatever the hell is going on, it's a different San Francisco team. But there are some benefits to them being so dominant is that there's plenty of garbage time where you get rack up stats. And, people like Devonta Smith plays well late in the game. So there is going to be room for some some garbage time points potentially. But the problem is now we're looking at possibly Drew Lock because Geno's a little banged up. Now, this is the 6th most fantasy points allowed out wide, Ben. So what's your thoughts here? Are you willing to take a shot on one of the Seattle Seahawks wide receivers against the 49ers?
Yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head there. Drew Lock. That's really scary. I don't particularly want Drew Lock being the guy that I'm trusting to get me into the fantasy playoffs by getting enough targets to DK Metcalf, or even worse, Tyler Lockett. At least DK had a good game last week, and he has been good in good matchups. The only exception was actually against San Francisco 2 weeks ago, but he still had 9 targets. He just only managed 3 receptions for 32 yards. But there are a lot of really close ones where he could have gotten off big plays. He just didn't. So when you have a good matchup, as a general rule, you have to start DK Metcalf, assuming Geno Smith is playing. If Geno's not playing, I'd feel really scared about starting DK Metcalf. We know that Drew Lock can pass the ball. He's not totally hopeless. He's not, Tim Boyle. But he is someone who's going to be a little bit of a downgrade on Geno. Now, Tyler Lockett's the really weird one. He's averaging 8 targets a week, but only 55 yards. So he's not making the most of his opportunities. Last game against San Fran, he had 3 for 30. I just don't think he can start Tyler Lockett anymore. I think he's at best a flex option. He's the kind of guy you can start if you're desperate. And I've got a lot of Tyler Lockett. I'm a big fan. I've been a fan for years. I've always drafted a lot of him. And this is finally the year where it's gone the wrong way for me. And I think we just have to acknowledge that this is not the game for Tyler Lockett. It should be, but I don't think it will be. I think Jackson Smith-Njigba's too involved. I just think it really caps Lockett's upside. He's going to have occasional big games. I just don't see this as being likely to be one, especially if Geno Smith is out.
Yeah, I think that's where I lie in this whole situation. If Geno's in, I probably feel a lot more comfortable just starting these guys if they need to be a wide receiver 3 for you this week. San Francisco's just so dominant right now. Like, sometimes just a switch turns on and you don't want to mess around anymore with that defense. Like, that defense has every single level pretty much checked off. They did lose one of their safeties, which is key. He was a really good player, but they got Chase Young up front, so God only knows what could happen up there too, especially with the Seahawks kind of having a lot of issues staying healthy up front over the course of the season. But you know what? I think this is going to be one of those default come to Sunday live shows because, like, I actually think there's going to be areas where I would actually be okay starting them. But as soon as we hear more about Geno, we'll probably get back to you on all that. All right, let's jump down to the next one. It's Zay Flowers and Odell Beckham going up against the Rams. Now, slight revenge game for Odell Beckham in this matchup. The Rams do allow the 7th most fantasy points out wide. Some notable performances this over the last few weeks: Elijah Moore, Marquise Brown, DK Metcalf, CeeDee Lamb, Brandin Cooks. What's your thoughts about Zay Flowers this week? Is he an auto start for you? And is Odell, are you willing to stream him this week in this matchup?
Zay Flowers is really scary to me. I know we think of Zay Flowers as being like this, must start. He's been a rookie breakout. He's been fantastic. He really hasn't been. He's just been very consistent, but consistently average. He's yet to top 80 yards in a game this season. Last season, he really only saved himself by getting 2 touchdowns. But he's only scored a touchdown in 2 games this season. Outside those games since where he scored touchdowns, since week 1, he hasn't had a top 24 finish. So we're talking about a guy that really lacks upside and needs those touchdowns to make it happen. Now, will he get more touchdowns now that Mark Andrews is out? maybe. He's been getting plenty of red zone targets. We have talked about that in the past, but I don't really want to start a guy who's touchdown or bust. I want to start guys who I can rely on. And I don't know that Zay Flowers is someone I can rely on as anything more than a wide receiver 3 flex option. Now, the fact that his floor's really good is something that can help you. So it depends on your situation. Are you a bit of an underdog? Do you need big points to be able to get into the playoffs? If so, I don't think Zay Flowers is the guy for you. If not, and you just need to be really safe and just get enough points on the board so that you can win or at least give yourself the best chance of winning, then sure, start Zay Flowers. He at least gives you a bit of a floor to work with and you can get your higher upside guys involved. Kind of in that similar situation that we talked about earlier with Jaylen Waddle, where you kind of need to start him. It's a solid matchup, but you know the upside's lacking. Odell Beckham, on the other hand, he hasn't run over 18 routes in a game since week 10. It's absolutely ridiculous. They're not using him at all. The production is really fluky. Now, when he's on the field, he gets used. But even with Mark Andrews out, they just haven't been putting him on the field. They put him on in specific situations, then they get the ball to him. But that is not reliable. You need him to break off big plays and get touchdowns to be able to produce. I don't think you can rely on that. I don't see any situation where I'd want to start Odell Beckham. You might be forced to based on your terrible other options. But for me, Odell Beckham is someone that I barely want to roster because I don't know when I'm going to ever feel good about starting him.
Yeah. And so this is another game where it's now December, folks. And if you don't know anything about the weather in December, it gets a little cold. And if you're playing a game in the Northeast or in the Chicago, Cleveland areas, weather will be impacted. This weekend, there's a couple games that could have weather. This is one of them. The Rams offense does look like they're finally finding their footing, but the problem is the Ravens on defense have finally found their footing. And so now it's a road game for Stafford playing against this Ravens defense. I just don't expect there to be fireworks like if it was in a dome game, maybe in LA, for example. When you look at the Rams defense too, they are air yards defense. They allow the 13th most air yards per game, but only 21st in yards after the catch. And that's how Zay Flowers beats you. He beats you in yards after the catch, not air yards. That's Odell's game. That being said, I'm just only starting Zay Flowers as a wide receiver 3 this week. Is he a must start? No. But because Mark Andrews went down, he's locked into probably 8 targets. And when you get that kind of targets, you're probably a safe bet, especially in PPR format. So I'm okay starting him in that matchup. Now, Ben, I know we got a couple slot matchups you want to break down. Let's get into it.
Yeah, let's do it. Look, firstly, you said nice cold games. You said the weather's cold. I'm thinking that sounds absolutely beautiful because it is the hottest weather you could ever imagine down here. It is absolutely boiling. So that sounds beautiful. I could do some nice cold matchups. Now, speaking of hot slot matchups, Jayden Reed against the Giants, Khalil Shakir against the Chiefs, Rashee Rice against the Bills, and Elijah Moore against the Jaguars. 4 guys that you would probably be considering starting in your lineups this week. So let's have a look at how they're likely to go. Well, Jayden Reed takes on the Giants. They're the 3rd best matchups against slot wide receivers. Demario Douglas got 6 receptions against them. CeeDee Lamb absolutely blew up, 11 for 151 and a touchdown. A lot of that came from the slot. Trey Tucker and Hunter Renfrow even managed to go 4 for 84 combined. So, look, they haven't really faced true stud slot wide receivers recently, but in the slot, they've been giving away receptions to players, and that's good for Jayden Reed, especially with the probability that Christian Watson's going to be out. Reed's been limited twice to open the week, but he should be good to go for Monday night. He hasn't previously had an increase in snaps when Watson or Dobbs are out, but that could change now that the season progressed. He's a rookie. Now that he's getting more experience, they may be able to trust him in 12 personnel. So what are we doing with Jayden Reed, Bobby?
Well, when you're looking, first of all, we get the slot matchup is key, right? Because Jayden Reed gets his slot. That's where he lines up the most. The other thing is Christian Watson is out. So that at least is probably going to funnel. I would hope that means Jayden Reed plays more, but I could see them easily put in Wicks and let him just play a bunch of routes out wide and keep Reed in his regular role. But I don't think that really matters. When you look at the Giants and how you beat their defense, it's yards after the catch. So 25th in air yards allowed per game on defense and 4th in yards after the catch. That's where Jayden Reed gets it done. 41st among qualified receivers in yards after the catch per reception. He's only 77th in ADOT. So right there tells me that the matchup in the slot is good. How he gets his fantasy points is good. Now, granted, the Giants play a ton of man. They're one of the most heavy man defenses in football, and Jayden Reed has proven to be a little better against zone, but I don't think that really matters. Jordan Love is playing well right now. As long as weather permits up in the Northeast, I actually do like him as a wide receiver 3 this week.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. He's a wide receiver 3 for me as well. My biggest concern with Jayden Reed is that he only has more than 4 receptions once this season. Now, he is supplementing that a lot with rushing yards. He's got 6 rushes in the last 6 weeks. I think that really helps. He's also got 4 touchdowns in the last 6 weeks, which is really helping. But he is in that boom-bust conversation, and he is the kind of guy where you've clearly got a lot of upside, and we haven't seen him play without Watson recently, and that might really help. But he is someone that's really hard to rely on. Speaking of people that are hard to rely on, Khalil Shakir. He is against the Chiefs, who are bizarrely the 4th best matchup against the slot. Now, they have actually been good against slot receivers. They kept Keenan Allen to 4 for 55, Jerry Jeudy 2 for 50. Christian Kirk blew up against them, but that was mostly out wide because Zay Jones got injured early in that game. It's actually been outside receivers traveling to the slot who've been mostly successful against the Chiefs. Shakir's only averaging 4 targets a week since taking over the starting role, but that's still a lot more targets than he was receiving previously. And in this Bills offense with Josh Allen, there's always upside when you're getting the ball past you a little bit. Can we start Khalil Shakir in such an important week?
It's so funny because my notes literally say non-slot guys have dominated in slot. So when you're looking through it, Jayden Reed 4 for 16, Hunter Renfrow 438, Jerry Jeudy 5 catches in 2 games. He did find the end zone in one of them, but I don't. It just seems like Gabe Davis is not going away, and I think it was last week or 2 weeks ago. Bills might have been out of bye last week. I can't remember off the top of my head, but yeah, it was the game where I think they played the Eagles, and Gabe Davis went off, and Shakir didn't do anything. So
13 targets the game.
I know.
After 0 the week before.
I know. Up from 0. There's no middle ground. It's like 0, 13. Like, why not? I think I'm going to probably not. I'm not going to get cute with this one. I know the matchup says it's good, but based on the information we have in front of us, he's a desperation start for me. I'm not going to start him myself.
Yep, I'm in the same situation. I'm not starting him. He's like a wide receiver 5 for me in that sort of region. On the other side, if we flip things around and go Chiefs versus Bills, which is the same thing. It's just on the other side. The Bills are also a good slot matchup. They are 8th against the slot. And, of course, the Chiefs have Rashee Rice as their number 1 wide receiver, and he is primarily a slot receiver. Now, the Bills are coming off being absolutely torn apart by the Eagles before their bye, but they have gone into a bye, and they've gotten a little bit healthier coming out of it. Before the Eagles tore them apart, they held Garrett Wilson to just 2 for 9, Jerry Jeudy 3 for 35, Tyler Boyd 3 for 56, Trey Palmer 3 for 22. But none of those guys outside maybe Wilson are considered particularly good, amazing slot wide receivers. The question is, can we trust Rashee Rice against the Bills, or are they going to go elsewhere?
So the thing with Rashee Rice now is that he's not just the slot guy. He's becoming the number 1. If you look at the last 3 games, he leads the team in targets even more than Travis Kelce. That's all I needed to hear. Because if you look at the guys who beat Buffalo struggles against the top targets in the receiving game. Now, most teams' top targets are outside. This case, it's in the slot, and it fits the narrative against Buffalo right now. They also do lean slightly more favorable for yards after the catch receivers this season, and that is Rashee Rice's game. So at some point, Mahomes has got to turn it on, right? At some point, Mahomes is going to be Mahomes. I think this Bills game against I think either it's going to be one of those games where Buffalo and Kansas City their offenses just don't get it done. But I'm going to lean towards this is a prime matchup. Buffalo needs to win this game. So they're going to come out and play. So I'm going to definitely start Rashee Rice. I have him probably as a wide receiver 2 this week.
Yeah, I think that's totally reasonable. The last 2 weeks, even though he's still only playing 70% of snaps, he has 19 targets. All the other wide receivers, and there's a lot of them, had 18 targets combined. The tight ends combined, not just Kelce, had 16 targets. The running backs had 11 targets. They're passing the ball a heap, but Rice is still the number 1 target. So I agree. He's someone you just have to start. He's a wide receiver 2 for me. Speaking of guys who have become the top target in their teams randomly in this case, Elijah Moore against the Jaguars. Now, the Jaguars are 9th against the slot, but they're also 11th against out wide. They're basically just a good matchup to pass on. Against the slot recently, well, they've had average results. Tyler Boyd went 5 for 37. Robert Woods went 2 for 40. The Titans guys went 2 for 17. But we're not talking about big names. That's who they've been playing against. Juwan Jennings, Allen Robinson. The fact they've been conceding a lot of points to the slot in that situation should tell you they've been going to their out wide receivers when they've traveled to the slots. Another one of these sort of situations. So while it's not the greatest slot matchup, it is a good matchup for a wide receiver, and it's a good situation for Elijah Moore, especially if Joe Flacco starts. We know that Joe Flacco and Elijah Moore were great for the Jets at the start of last season. We saw how good they were last game. Flacco gave him 12 targets for 4 for 83. Not particularly accurate, but he's Joe Flacco, so what do you expect? And if Amari Cooper is out, Moore becomes the top wide receiver in Cleveland. Do you have to start Elijah Moore, or is he someone you can get away with sitting, even if Cooper's out and Flacco plays?
We can't say Elijah Moore's a must-start player, but I think he's definitely earned consideration under the circumstances that Joe Flacco gets to start and Amari Cooper's out. So I wrote him up in my article this week for wide receiver starts and sits, and I basically said that. I said, if those two things happen, Amari Cooper's out and Joe Flacco gets – and by the way, Joe Flacco's going to start. DTR cleared concussion protocol, and they're like, yeah, we're not going to name a starter yet. Okay. Yeah, really? Every other team who wants to start their main guy, as soon as they clear, they're like, it's in. Let's go. First team reps. No, Flacco's been getting first team reps all week. He looked good enough last week. The Cleveland Browns, they're the weirdest 7-5 football team you ever seen in your life. But at the same time, they want to win games still. So if Amari Cooper doesn't, I think he got a limited practice in on Friday today. So I think he's going to be out. So I'm going to lean probably Elijah Moore lands on your wide receiver 3 map, especially because of the fact that Flacco and him do have that a little bit of chemistry, and they used him a little differently. They used him a little more outside, a little more vertically last week with Flacco and Amari Cooper out most of that game. So I like that a lot too for him. So he's probably on my wide receiver 3 map this week.
Yeah, I think he kind of slides into that area. He's someone who's just quietly getting a lot of targets a game. He's averaging over 7 targets a game, and that was before all this stuff happened. That's when he was playing with Deshaun Watson and other randos. He has 85 wide receiver targets this season. That's more than Christian Kirk. That's more than Calvin Ridley. That's more than Jaylen Waddle and Jordan Addison. We're talking about someone who's getting a lot of targets. Now, doesn't do a lot with them, but especially in PPR, volume targets is what you're looking for. Now, let's have a look at some out-wide downgrades. Let's talk about guys that you would usually start, but maybe this week it's just not the situation. We've got the Texans against the Jets. We have Chris Olave against the Panthers, and we have the Jags guys in that same Browns game we just talked about Elijah Moore from. So let's start it off with Nico Collins and Noah Brown. Now, obviously, Tank Dell being out makes a big difference. All of a sudden, Noah Brown becomes an every down wide receiver, and you can definitely ensure that Nico Collins will be the wide receiver 1 in that situation. The Jets are a very good defense. They are the toughest matchup against wide receivers, but they have been really susceptible against good pass offenses. They allowed 9 for 102 against Tyreek Hill. Jaylen Waddle, we already talked about this. He blew up against them. Keenan Allen, 8 for 77. AJ Brown, 7 for 131. Khalil Shakir, even, who we talked about earlier, 3 for 115. Against good wide receivers, they have been susceptible because good wide receivers will still get their targets and you can make big plays against the Jets. Does Nico Collins belong in that conversation?
After last week, yes. If you look at the target distribution last week, it was Nico Collins times 15,000, and then they sprinkled in maybe a throw over to Noah Brown once. Now, the matchup, like you brought up, I think that's the key. Elite ones, you just list the names. They all get theirs. And listen, when we're talking redraft fantasy football, maybe you don't play him in DFS. Maybe it's not a DFS play because he's probably one of the top 5 to 6 costly receivers now after his big performance. So maybe not there, but in redraft fantasy football, these guys all did very well, and all of them got between 15 to 20 fantasy points in PPR. Even Devontae Adams with whatever the hell they've been throwing at quarterback too. So the other thing I like about this is that I think a lot of us, I know the Jets are good across the board at cornerback, but really everyone's worried about Sauce Gardner. But the good thing about the Jets for us is that they do not use him to shadow. He stays on one side of the field, and it's the side of the field that Nico runs less of his routes. So he's going to probably be facing more Reed on the other side, DJ Reed. So the alphas play well. The matchup's probably fine. Plus, like we just brought up, I mean, if you watch last week's game, you cannot sit him with any confidence at all. I mean, he played the Broncos. The Broncos are they've been just as hot. They have Patrick Surtain. You can make an argument they're just as good as the Jets right now. So no way, not sitting them. Definitely. But I do have a hot question for you at the end of the show.
Okay, I look forward to that one. Look, I totally agree with you as well. Nico Collins is going against everything we usually expect. And there are two situations that really work for him this week. The first is Tank Dell being out. When Tank Dell's been out or limited, he's averaged 140 yards and a touchdown on average when Tank Dell is out or limited. Plus, he's been better in tough matchups against the Ravens. He got 6 for 80. Against the Steelers, 7 for 168 and 2 touchdowns. And last week against the Broncos, 191 for a touchdown against the Broncos. He's very hard to sit in this situation. Totally agree with you. Noah Brown, by the way, someone that we also listed up there. For the second week in a row, he's practiced on Wednesday and Thursday, but not on Friday. He played full snaps last week, but only got 2 targets for no catches. I think until we see it happen, it's going to be really hard to rely on him, but it is someone you can throw out there if you absolutely have to. Now, let's talk about Chris Olave. Speaking of people who've been limited this week, he's missed practice all week with the flu, and as someone who's got a bit of a cold myself, I can sympathize with that. Having said that, the Panthers...
Look at you toughing it out like that. It's premonition right there. You're stepping up. You're here. You're playing, and you're doing well. That makes me feel like Chris Olave is going to do well now. I love this.
I perform better under pressure, as we can clearly see, and so does Chris Olave, or maybe he doesn't. We're about to find out whether that's the case this week. Having said that, do they need to throw against the Panthers? That's been the question that everyone's had to ask every week that someone plays against the Panthers. They're the 5th toughest matchup, and it's not because their secondary is amazing. They do get JC Horn back, which really helps, but realistically, most of the time, teams don't need to throw on them. The one exception was last week when Mike Evans went 7 for 162 and a touchdown, just doing random Mike Evans things. But DeAndre Hopkins, 3 for 49, CeeDee Lamb, 6 for 38, DJ Moore, 5 for 58, Michael Pittman, 8 for 64, Nico Collins himself, 4 for 30, and Tank Dell, 3 for 16. That's a lot of pretty good names without a lot of receiving yards. Can we trust Chris Olave in this really awkward Panthers matchup?
Yes, because of the fact that the injuries to the other receivers have just put a hyper focus on Chris Olave. If you just look at the last few weeks, he has been a target monster. And the other thing is, like we just brought up, you just said this too with Mike Evans, but the main guys get there. CeeDee Lamb found the end zone, 6 receptions. Tyreek Hill, 6 receptions, 163 yards, a touchdown. Michael Pittman, 8 receptions for 64. Those don't sound like 8 for 64 isn't sexy, but in PPR, that's perfectly fine. That's high-end wide receiver 2 numbers there. Olave historically against the Panthers has played very well. 6 for 83, 5 for 60 and 1, and 9 for 147. The matchup he's been able to exploit. They don't have anybody like A.T. Perry. Like, come on, they're not targeting A.T. Perry a bunch. That's not happening. Lynn Bowden, like, stop it. It's Chris Olave's show, and I do want to ask. They are playing at home. Yes, and they're in their home. This is another one of those good dome matchups that Chris Olave, Derek Carr, and all them play better at home. So I like that a lot as well.
Yeah, look, he should be able to make something happen. My only concern is that no quarterback has thrown for over 205 passing yards against the Panthers since week 6 when Tua did it. Now, a lot of players did it in the first 6 weeks. I think 4 of the first 6 weeks. Opposing quarterbacks threw for at least 250 yards. Since then, no one over 205. For some reason, teams just realized, the Panthers are really easy to run on. We should probably just keep it really safe and run on them all day. And the Saints are someone who loves running on teams. They'll use Alvin Kamara. They'll use Jamal Williams. They'll use Taysom Hill. Do they even need to pass on him?
some of that too is the offense is so bad. Like the Panthers aren't scoring. They can't stop the run. That's a bad recipe for passing offenses. They did show some life last week against the Bucks. They did have a bunch of changes in there. Frank Wright is now gone and they fired a bunch of people. So maybe there's something going on there and they could show a little more. Chuba Hubbard had a nice game for them. So it's a lot of this is going to have to be, can the offense play better for the Panthers to force defense to throw? And can they just do anything to stop the freaking run? Maybe J.C. Horn and them being healthy will allow them to spend more resources in the front seven and allow people to get in the box more. But until we see it, I get it. It's just the fact that Chris Olave could get 80% of the targets this week. It could be something crazy like that, and I'm not sitting him because of that.
Yeah, totally agree. I mean, that's what Mike Evans did last week. Mike Evans got literally 80% of the receiving yards for the team last week, and that's happened for most of the number one wide receivers. They're nearly always getting the majority of receiving yards. And whether it's Derek Carr or Jameis Winston or some weird combination of the two, I feel like you still have to start Olave. Now, the last guy is someone that we talk about having to start when he sucks and then randomly blows up when we're not expecting it either. It's Calvin Ridley, who has been so difficult for fantasy managers all season. I reckon he's probably been the most frustrating player for fantasy managers this season. He's just been all over the place. Like, it's one thing if your player sucks and you can just sit him, but Calvin Ridley isn't sucking. He has these massive blow-up games, and then the next week when we expect him to have a really good game, he really struggles. He takes on the Browns, which is a really tough matchup. It's the 8th toughest against out wide in the last 6 games, but season long, it's even worse than that. They're one of the toughest matchups in the league just across the board. The secondary is very good. They've got a good front four. It's really difficult to start players against the Browns. Can we start Calvin Ridley, and will we even consider Zay Jones?
How dare you ask me these questions? I don't want to. I don't. It's one of those games now. Trevor Lawrence is banged up. It's going up against a Browns defense, so I knew just got smoked on the road. But a couple things factored in there. No Denzel Ward last week. I think he's going to be back this week, should be in there. That changes the whole dynamic of that defense because Ward is that elite one that could shut down outside guys. And it also puts the rest of the secondary back to where they're supposed to be. You're not having a bunch of guys out wide they don't need to be. But the other thing that if you're looking at the Browns at home this season, it's another thing like we talk a lot about offensive players, but defenses also could play better at home. The weather could help too, the Cleveland weather at that home game. But here's some notable wide receiver performances at home when the Browns have played at home. Marquise Brown, 6.4 PPR points, 7.7 George Pickens, Brandon Ayuk, 11.6, Zay Flowers, 8. So that's not a lot of juiciness there for wide receiver ones against this defense at home. And the other thing that if you're looking at air yards, which is Calvin Ridley's game, by the way, he's an air yards receiver this season. This is the toughest air yards matchup in football. So it just doesn't. You just talked about boom bust, right? Like Calvin Ridley this season, 50% of his games have been 10 PPR points, 50%. That's horrible. But a third of his games have been 17 PPR points. So like that's the boom bust factor you're talking about. I just don't want to do it. You can't make me do it, Ben. I won't do it. I'm not starting him. I'm out on Calvin Ridley, and I don't even want to bother with Zay Jones until I see it.
Yeah. We kind of did see it with Zay Jones last week, which is interesting. He did get 5 for 78 on 8 targets. He does have the volume upside, but in this matchup, we know he's going to get full snaps, but I agree. We need to see it consistently with Zay Jones to really rely on that. And the same thing with Calvin Ridley. And with both of them, the biggest issue is we don't even know if Trevor Lawrence is going to play. And if he is going to play, how healthy is he? I just don't think you can trust either of these guys, even with Christian Kirk out. We saw what the Rams did against them, but I feel like that was just a fluke.
And that's the other thing here I want to say. This is a bad matchup on the road against Cleveland. But that Kirk injury, you might have just fell into an absolute gem in Ridley for the playoff run. Like, he's going to get much better days ahead for Ridley for your playoff stretch. We'll probably be talking about him again. That Christian Kirk injury is huge.
Yeah, totally agree with you. Now, speaking of other guys who are going to be good this week or stashes that you should consider for the playoffs, let's talk about my weekly streamers and stashes. It's my article that comes out I think it's Tuesday your time, Bobby?
Wednesday.
I can never really.
Tuesday our time. You're right. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep.
And if you read it early, and hopefully you did, you'll know that my favorite running back streamer of the week was Ezekiel Elliott. You're welcome, people. If you didn't, however, what are you doing? Go and read it early. Having said that, there are a couple of other guys I want to shout out this week. I like Joe Flacco against, even in this matchup where the Browns are starting to get their passing game going, assuming he starts, Joe Flacco is a QB stream for me. I also don't mind Russell Wilson. He's an option for you. Running back streamers, I already talked about Zeke, but my favorite under-the-radar running back streamer, Tyjae Spears. This is a game where I expect against the Dolphins, they're going to need to chase a lot. And that could mean a lot of checkdowns, and it generally means a lot of stats for Spears when they're behind. Wide receiver-wise, we talked about Jayden Reed a little bit. He's someone I quite like this week, and Brandin Cooks, both guys we talked about, and Elijah Moore. We're basically covering all my wide receiver streamers. And my favorite tight end streamer this week is someone that I didn't expect to ever have on this list, Gerald Everett. He has suddenly taken over that starting role. He is someone that you consider in your lineups this week if you feel like you need a tight end streamer outside of your normal guys that you're going to already.
All right, Ben, I got a question for you. And this is we're gonna just start a segment called Answer Bob's Lineup Question of the Week. So I need a wide receiver, 3, and a flex. Okay, so I have a bunch of guys. I'm just gonna give you the whole list of receivers I got because everybody's kind of that wide receiver 2, wide receiver 1. Here's the list: DJ Moore, Chris Olave, Jaylen Waddle, Brandin Cooks, Nico Collins, and then I also have DeAndre Swift for a flex. So, of those guys, who are you starting at receiver, and are you considering Swift as a flex?
So, can you say it was DJ Moore,
Jaylen Waddle, Chris Olave, Brandin Cooks, Nico Collins, and DeAndre Swift. Start 2.
Gosh, that is really difficult, isn't it?
It is not fun. It hasn't been fun for me. It's not been fun at all.
I feel like we talked about Chris Olave. I feel like you kind of have to start Chris Olave. It's one of those situations where you really need to. And the same situation with Nico Collins. I know they're bad matchups, but you just need to start them. If something you would feel so ridiculous if they absolutely blew up, which they very easily could, and they're left on your bench. You really only need one of the two to blow up to make it work. For me, I'd consider those two. I'm a little bit scared of starting DeAndre Swift this week. We're starting to see a little bit more Kenny Gainwell, which is not ideal. And against Dallas, it's not the kind of situation where you can expect him to run a whole heap. So DeAndre Swift's a little bit too scary. I'd much rather the receiver who's at least got that PPR floor. What are you going to do, or what do you think you're going to do?
Right now, I have more Olave Waddle in, and then I'm kind of flip-flop between Nico and Brandin Cooks, because Cooks has like you said, Cooks matchup at home, everything lines up for Cooks. Nico is all right, he's your stud now. No Tank Dell. It's more of all right, do you stick with the guy who is the stud in a tough matchup, or do you play that wide receiver 3 with the elite matchup? And that's where I'm now. Personally, maybe the play is to sit Waddle. Because, no offense, but Waddle, we kind of just talked about Waddle. When he blows up, he gets you 15 fantasy points. The one game he had this year against New England was awesome, right? But then the next time, the next time he played the 2 games against New England, he had the 4 for 80 game, which is boring and half PPR. It's 10 fantasy points. Then he blew up. But every other game, he's been very in half PPR, 10 fantasy points. So maybe I just, maybe I sit Waddle. That's why I'm all place, right? Because it just seems
I think I think I'd probably sit Waddle.
All right. Well, I can't wait for that. Join us on Sunday as I still tilt for the next 48 hours, folks. But that's all we got today. I want to thank my co-host today, Ben Wasley. Make sure you go follow him at Fantasy First Down on Twitter. Check him out everywhere. He's got great content, great rankings. Go follow him. And make sure you check out his articles on Razzball.com. Make sure you join us this Sunday live for the Sunday Live Start Sit Show for 2 hours. We're going to be breaking down all your start sit questions and going over the weather updates and injury updates you need to know up until kickoff. Thank you for joining once again. Make sure you follow me as well at Bobby LaMarco and go over to football.razzball.com. We are out of here, folks.